KDKR, Decatur, Dallas, Fort Worth. KYJC, Commerce. KMWC, Bethany. Portions of KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, has the church regained its voice when it comes to politics? Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thanks so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, some significant changes could be headed our way, which forever maybe changes the culture of this country. We're talking about the Johnson Amendment, and IRS expert Dan Pilla is here to discuss the details of what you need to know. Dan, always good to have you on the program.
And it's always my pleasure to talk with you, Bob. How you doing?
I'm doing good. I got a kick out of your tax newsletter that you send out. The title of it, I thought, well, this will get some attention. Gambling, Taxes, and Churches.
Yeah.
Let's
quite
see.
Quite a mix of topics.
How are we going to bring that all together? Okay, so let's start with the Johnson Amendment. You talk about one of the phrases you use, I think, is perfect. You use the metaphor of bought silence. Talk a little bit about that. And you know what's interesting, before I keep my mouth shut and let you talk, is this is not getting a whole lot of news coverage. Do you think?
I don't think it's getting any news coverage, Bob. The only place that I see any coverage on it whatsoever is in the the highly technical news sources that I look at that come from subscription-based tax news sources. So Bloomberg, for example, had some stuff, and tax analysts had some stuff, but people pay a lot of money for those news sources, and that they're not mainstream by any means whatsoever. I've not seen 4 syllables of coverage in what you would call mainstream media on this so-called Johnson Amendment, and I would suggest to you, Bob, that there's not one person in 3,000 that knows what the Johnson Amendment even is and how it affects churches in the first place, including, I would argue to you, pastors don't know what it is.
It's huge. To me, when I first heard this, and it was about a year ago, in fact, I remember sending you an email, and you responded back with all this great information about what was going on. But even back a year ago, it didn't even seem like it was getting hardly any press. And I thought, man, this is such a big deal.
It is a big deal, but that begs the question, Bob, and I remember your email, but I don't remember the news source that you linked to me. Of course, I had a different news source, and I sent some stuff back to you. Of course, I had a pretty significant background in tax-exempt organizations anyway, which is what the Johnson Amendment's all about. But what was the news source you cited that you came across?
I can't even remember. That was a while back.
Yeah. Now, would it have been one of your subscription-based news sources? Because I know you get some pretty technical news information yourself. Do you think it came from one of those, maybe?
I do remember it was a pretty random. It wasn't like your Fox News or anything like that. It was pretty.
All right. Well, let's not leave the listeners in suspense here. But let's define what the Johnson Amendment is. Let's talk about that. All right. The Johnson Amendment applies to Internal Revenue Code Section 501C. And 501C is the provision of law that exempts certain organizations from federal taxation. All right, so churches, charitable organizations, educational organizations, they're exempt from taxation under Section 501C3. All right, now what happened is in the 1950s, a senator by the name of Lyndon Johnson, remember the name Lyndon Johnson? He later became president in 1963 after our President Kennedy was shot. All right, Lyndon Johnson was a senator from Texas, of course. He introduced the Johnson Amendment into Congress. It became law. And what the Johnson Amendment did is it added language to that code section 501C that provided that any organization to be exempt from federal income taxation could not participate in any campaign for in any individual campaign for public office, and could not get involved in any political issues that involved legislation. So in other words, they could not speak out either for or against a policy issue that was in an election cycle. They could not speak out for or against a particular candidate during an election cycle. And so this provision of law essentially silenced the churches. This is my phrase and this is my view. And of course, this is the issue that was, well, we'll talk about the case in a second, but this is the allegation that came forward, is that the churches have essentially been silenced as a result of this provision in Code Section 501. And what they're saying, what Congress said at the time, and the law that's existed all this time, is saying, okay, churches, you can't have an opinion on these public policy issues. The problem with that, Bob, is public policy issues are inextricably tied to religious views. I mean, it's for example, the question of abortion. Is that a political issue or is that a religious issue?
Right.
It's both of them, right? It's
right.
both. How about homosexual marriage? How about gender identity? These are both political and religious issues. All right, and to say that churches can't get involved in speaking out one way or the other on the abortion issue is to essentially, and what they're silencing, of course, is the Christian message. That's the whole idea, is to silence the Christian message, because God forbid we have any Christian biblical principles here as our worldview in this country.
Right.
So that of course turned out to be the focus.
So talk a little bit about some of the history of this. I mean, Lyndon Baines Johnson issues this amendment, and I mean, what was the reaction to it from some historical resources that him doing that? What was really the reason? Because I looked at that and I thought to myself, from a politician standpoint, that's a big deal. I mean, you silence some very influential voting blocks.
No doubt. Well, and the theory behind it is that because churches are exempt from taxation, they shouldn't be able to have their opinions subsidized by taxpayers who might not necessarily believe that same thing. And that's a pretty weak argument, but that's the argument that they use, because this idea that we shouldn't have things subsidized that we don't agree with. Well, what about subsidizing war? There are plenty of people that don't believe in war. What about subsidizing this, these over-the-top welfare programs? You got plenty of people that don't believe in that. And so, it's just it was a red herring sort of argument that they used, but that's kind of what they stood on, and they stood on it for all these years.
It's interesting. I just can't get past the one thing, which is the First Amendment. Free speech. I see how you could justify that.
Well, and the short answer, Bob, is that you can't justify it. And in fact, what has happened here now is what has brought this to light is the national religious broadcasters, along with a couple of churches, filed a lawsuit against the IRS. Claiming that the enforcement of the Johnson Amendment against churches and religious organizations with a public presence does exactly that. It silences it eviscerates their First Amendment right. And let's keep in mind that the First Amendment, the entire purpose of the free speech clause in the First Amendment is not to support and defend internet pornography. It's to support and defend political speech, right? The founding fathers were first and foremost focused on the idea of government silencing political speech, which of course the Crown did ruthlessly during the founding era in the colonies, which later of course became the United States. So their concern was that there never be a law that would be allowed to exist at the federal level. Of course, the First Amendment was a proscription against the federal government to silence political speech. Because if you look at the First Amendment in totality, You've got the freedom of religion and the freedom of assembly and the freedom of speech and the freedom of petition to petition a government for redress of grievances. All of these things revolve around political speech, and that's exactly what the Johnson Amendment does. Is it quashes political speech from a religious organization, the very organizations that should be speaking out about individual rights and the concepts of biblical truth and so on.
You also referenced one of your books, and I apologize, I can't remember the title to it. That you reference. I hope I don't mispronounce this. Alexis de Tocqueville.
Yeah, Alexis de Tocqueville.
Close enough.
And Alexis de Tocqueville was and he is mentioned in my book Salt and Light.
Yes, Salt and Light.
The Secret to Restoring America's Christian Culture is the book, and I talk about Alexis de Tocqueville's tour of the United States during the 19th century. De Tocqueville was a French jurist and philosopher, and he toured America for a period of about 9 years in the middle 1800s, just before the American Civil War. And he toured America with the question on his mind, how did America become such a great country so fast? Remember, she only became a nation, officially a nation with the adoption of the United States Constitution in 1789. Of course, the Articles of Confederation were about 10 years earlier than that, little bit later than call it 1780, let's say, and so she was not a nation for very long, and yet she was growing very fast and becoming very prominent on the world stage. And de Tocqueville was saying, how's that happening, right? There's been nations on the planet for thousands of years that haven't grown at all, and here's America springing up and growing. And so he toured America, and he then published a book called Democracy in America, which studied the culture of America and the legal system and the economic system, and he addressed this question of how she became so great so fast. And he tied it directly to America's Christian culture, and he pointed out that there was no institution in America that stood stronger or taller than America's Christian institutions, and he believed that her greatness was due to her righteousness, and the righteousness, of course, that would derive from the Holy Scriptures, the Bible.
Well, talk a little bit about where everything is legally in the legal process.
Yeah, what's going on here is that the IRS has actually agreed that they should not be enforcing this Johnson Amendment against churches. It's ironic that it was the National Religious Broadcasters that brought the case. Again, there were two churches involved as well. I don't have their names right in front of me here now, but the injunction that the IRS has agreed to applies to political speech by churches. And the idea is that as long as the church is speaking out in a religious context to its parishioners on issues of religious matters that are relevant to the petitioner's daily walk, the parishioner's daily walk, then that speech can't be silenced. So if you've got a pastor that's in the pulpit that's speaking out about an abortion issue that might be on a ballot coming up, or speaking out about state-sanctioned abortion generally, that speech cannot be silenced under the Johnson Amendment. So what the lawsuit does not do is it does not eliminate, it does not eviscerate the Johnson Amendment. There's no repeal of that. Right? Only Congress can repeal it. Of course, a court could strike it down as unilaterally unconstitutional, but they haven't done that. Now, that's the first thing. The second thing is this is a consent judgment. So the IRS and the plaintiffs in the case are coming to an agreement that this should be the court order. All right, so this is not an independent decision by the judge. It's a decision by the parties, which, by the way, is very common in civil cases, where the parties get together and say, okay, we agree to settle this case, and here are going to be the terms. That settlement, the proposed settlement, has not yet been adopted by the courts, at least not since I looked last, which was about a week and a half ago, maybe not even that long, maybe a week ago. still has not been adopted by the court. I expect it will be, but what happened, Bob, is in the meantime, a number of parties intervened in the case. A lot of the parties that intervened are supporting the proposed resolution that the IRS not enforce this Johnson Amendment. Some of the parties, like the left-leaning organizations that intervened, are saying no. We need the Johnson Amendment. We can't have churches out there talking about these things and arguing this subsidy argument that I brought up earlier.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thanks so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Talking to IRS expert Dan Pilla. If you want more information on Dan, you can always go to a great website, www.taxhelponline.com. So let me ask you a question. When you start to mix together money, politics, and church, and human nature, there's going to be probably the majority of pastors are going to do the right thing, but it does concern me. I had a pastor one time say something that always stuck with me: "If your head's made of butter, don't sit by the fire." And
and I am going to remember that too. That makes a lot of sense.
And you just see, I just wonder how out of control that aspect of it can be. I mean, that's a worrisome, trinity, if you will.
Well, it is a worrisome trinity, Bob. But this idea of taking money out of politics, I'm certainly not ever going to agree with Bernie Sanders on just about anything. But I do agree with him that people need to have their say in politics.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And for the average person, for Jane and Joe American, the way you have that say in politics is you give money to somebody, an individual or organization that supports the things you believe in. Right? That is political speech in a very true sense. So Bob Brooks, for example, may never, ever run for president, probably won't run for the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House of Representatives there in Texas, but he certainly can give his support to somebody who is, if that person supports the things that Bob Brooks believes in.
Right.
That is equivalent to free speech. It's equivalent to political speech. I'm not going to be the guy to stand on the platform, but I'm going to support another guy who stands on the platform on my behalf. All right, that is just a natural extension of free speech, and we can't interfere with that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was just thinking from the standpoint of everything has its good and bad points with it, but overall, I mean, this is such a huge deal. Yeah, no doubt. And you can't escape the fact that we are fallen people, right? And there's darkness out there, and just how do you fix that? Well, you fix that with the second coming of the Messiah. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about a video that you had that you do have up on your site, and it looks at the top 10 tax questions that were asked to ChatGPT or artificial intelligence, and it's been really interesting to watch the news stories come out about artificial intelligence and how it's going to replace everybody. It's going to replace financial advisors. It's going to replace the CPA and all this type of thing. I think it's a great resource and can give you good information, no question at all. But especially from a tax standpoint, how do you trust the accuracy of AI to give you the right answer? Because that's a learned approach as far as AI goes, and the taxes obviously are very complicated.
Well, the short answer is I don't think you can trust it. I just don't think that there's any way that you can take the artificial intelligence models the way they are right now today and put absolute faith in them. I've talked about this with some AI people that know more about it than I do, and not the least of which is my son Josh, and who does the podcast with me, by the way.
Right.
But he's pointed out to me over and over again, AI, particularly ChatGPT, but not just that platform, others as well. It hallucinates, Bob, and so it makes up stuff when it doesn't know an accurate answer, it makes up stuff. And so unless you have some fundamental knowledge of the issue you're asking AI to speak to, there is a real danger that you're just going to get fundamentally false information.
Okay, so here's the scenario. I have a complicated tax problem. I use AI to help me figure out the answer, and AI was wrong. What's the IRS? How's the IRS respond?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't seen any cases so far where somebody took that issue to court. I have seen, though, we have some historical data from cases that have come out of tax court where somebody said, well, I prepared my tax return using tax preparation software. And the tax preparation software was wrong, and so therefore I shouldn't owe penalties. Well, what the courts have said about that pretty typically is garbage in, garbage out. Did you give the right information to the tax preparation software such that it would give you the correct answer on the back end? And if somebody put in the wrong information on the front end, they can't rely on the computer software to give them a correct answer on the back end. So apply that to ChatGPT. You're going to have to give 100% accurate fact information to GPT, to your AI platform, no matter what it is, right? You're going to have to give 100% of the applicable facts and circumstances to the platform in the form of your question in order to have any hope of getting a correct answer on the back end. So anything that's vague, Bob, anything that's incomplete, anything that's misstating a fact, is just going to be completely unreliable.
Well, I went ahead and ran my own top 10 most common questions about taxes and got some pretty interesting ones. So here we go, Dan Pilla. Why do we pay taxes? What's the point?
Why do we?
Number 10.
Judge, former United States Supreme Court Justice Learned Hand once said, taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society. And so that was his way of saying that taxes support, and this would be Dan Pilla's answer, taxes are necessary to support the legitimate, highlight the word legitimate, functions of government. So on a local level, the legitimate functions of government are providing police support, providing fire defense, right? Fire stations and so on, and providing roads and providing traffic control. Right? That'd be certainly a legitimate function of local government, and those functions need to be supported, and taxes would do that. At a state level, you need a court system, Bob. You need a system where people can go into the courts with their complaints about one another, and have a sound, reliable system of the administration of justice. And so that's a function that needs to be supported. Of course, people have to have protection from other citizens against force and fraud, right? So we need a criminal system to defend against that. So you need state courts for that function as well. And at the federal level, the United States Constitution charges the federal government with the duty to provide for the national defense and a couple of other things. And so if you're going to do those legitimate functions of government, you need taxes for those things as well.
Yeah, real quick, the number 9 one, I think they're asking maybe the wrong question, but the question is, how can I get a bigger tax refund?
Well, they are asking the wrong question, and because the answer depends on the specific facts and circumstances of your case. And first of all, you don't want a big tax refund. You want a small tax refund, right? Because you don't ever want to pay more taxes in than you owe in the first place, and that's what a refund is. It's a refund of taxes that you paid into the IRS that you don't owe. And so why would you want to do that? So you don't want a bigger refund. You want to adjust your withholding to match your tax liability. But the real question is, how do I minimize my taxes?
Yes.
That's really what the guy's trying to ask. And the answer to that is you got to make sure that you're claiming all the deductions and credits and exemptions you're entitled to.
Let me give out your website, www.taxhelponline.com, and we'll see what happens the next 30 days, and we'll talk next month.
All right, sounds good, Bob.
Okay, Dan, always good talking to you.
Bye.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. you know I do appreciate it. Dan is a wealth of information when it comes to dealing with the IRS, and all of his books, free resources can be found at taxhelponline.com. Well, if you got a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.